The day death came to Shalem. The screams began before sunrise. 16-year-old Asher bolted upright as villagers rushed through the streets. Smoke rose from the eastern fields. Men shouted warnings. Women gathered their children. "What happened?" Asher asked. His father grabbed a spear. His face was pale. "The plague has returned." Fear swept through Shalem like a storm. Just days earlier, everyone had celebrated the largest harvest in years. Now, healthy people were collapsing without warning. By noon, 3 of Asher's closest friends were dead. By sunset, the village burial ground was overflowing. Asher stood beside a fresh grave, his fists clenched. "Why would God allow this?" he whispered. No answer came. That night, an old traveler arrived at the village gate. His eyes seemed ancient, as though he carried secrets from another age. Looking at the terrified crowd, he spoke words that chilled everyone. "The God of Israel is the one who kills and makes alive." The villagers murmured angrily. What kind of God gives life and takes it away? But the old man's next words were even more disturbing. "And before this ends, one among you will die and live again." Asher felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no idea that the prophecy was about him. The stranger's warning. The next morning, the villagers gathered around the old traveler. Fear filled the air as the plague continued spreading from house to house. Families searched desperately for answers, but the stranger offered none. Instead, he repeated the same unsettling words. "The God of Israel is the one who kills and makes alive." The crowd grew restless. Some demanded an explanation, while others mocked him. Yet the old man remained calm, as if he knew something they did not. Asher could not stop thinking about the prophecy. One among them would die and live again. The words haunted him throughout the day. Then tragedy struck. His younger sister, Miriam, suddenly became ill. What began as a fever quickly worsened. By evening, she could barely speak, and her strength faded with each passing hour. For 3 days, Asher stayed by her side, praying desperately for a miracle. Before leaving the village, the traveler visited their home and said, "The greatest sickness here is not the plague, but the condition of the human heart." The villagers called him a madman and drove him away. Asher watched him disappear into the wilderness, unaware that his warning was about to come true. The Valley of Sorrow. 3 days after the traveler left, the fever finally claimed Miriam's life. The moment her breathing stopped, a silence fell over the house that felt heavier than any storm. Asher stared at his sister's still face, unable to believe she was gone. Just days earlier, she had been laughing in the fields. Now, she was gone forever. The village gathered for her burial at sunset. Asher stood beside the grave, his hands trembling with grief. He listened as prayers were spoken, but the words felt distant. His heart was filled with questions that no one could answer. That night, he wandered alone through the hills overlooking Shalem. Anger burned inside him. He had prayed. He had believed. Yet God had remained silent. "If you are truly there," Asher shouted into the darkness, "why didn't you save her?" Only the wind answered. Days turned into weeks. The plague continued spreading and graves multiplied across the valley. The once vibrant village was becoming a place of mourning. One evening, Asher found himself standing among the burial grounds. Looking across the rows of graves, he remembered the traveler's strange words. "The God of Israel is the one who kills and makes alive." For the first time, those words no longer sounded mysterious. They sounded frightening. But Asher had no idea that his greatest encounter with death was still ahead of him. The cave in the hills. Unable to escape his grief, Asher spent his days wandering the hills beyond Shalem. Ever since Miriam's death, he avoided the crowded village and preferred the silence of the wilderness. The questions in his heart had become heavier than the burden on his shoulders, and no one seemed able to answer them. One afternoon, while tracking a wounded deer through a rocky valley, he noticed a narrow opening hidden behind a cluster of stones. Curiosity overcame caution, and he stepped inside. The cave stretched deeper than he expected, its walls covered with ancient carvings worn by time. Asher ran his fingers across the markings and discovered words speaking of God's power over life and death. The message fascinated him. Could there really be meaning behind the suffering that had shattered his world? Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath his feet. A loud cracking sound echoed through the cave. Before he could escape, massive rocks crashed from above, sealing the entrance. Trapped in darkness, Asher shouted for help until his voice grew weak. Panic gripped his heart as the reality settled in. For the first time since Miriam's death, Asher realized that he might soon face death himself. The prayer he never planned to pray hours turned into days inside the dark cave. Hunger gnawed at Asher's stomach, and thirst left him weak and dizzy. He searched desperately for a way out, pushing against fallen rocks and feeling along the walls for an opening. But every effort ended in failure. As the darkness stretched on, fear began to overwhelm him. For the first time, Asher truly believed he might die alone in that cave. Thoughts of Miriam filled his mind. He remembered her smile, her laughter, and the day he had stood helplessly beside her grave. The anger he had carried since her death suddenly felt heavier than the stones trapping him. Exhausted, Asher collapsed onto the cold cave floor. There was no strength left to fight. Through tears, he finally spoke honestly to God. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't understand why Miriam died. I don't understand why this is happening to me, but I need you." For a moment, there was only silence. Then he noticed a faint beam of sunlight shining through a crack in the rocks. Hope stirred within him. Following the light, he discovered a narrow opening hidden behind the rubble. With the last of his strength, Asher squeezed through and emerged into the daylight. The villagers called it luck. Asher knew it was mercy. A Village Awakens news of Asher's survival spread quickly throughout Shalem. People could hardly believe he had escaped after being trapped inside the cave for days. Some called it a miracle from God, while others dismissed it as a fortunate accident. Everywhere he went, villagers whispered about his strange experience. But the greatest change was not that Asher had survived. It was what had happened to his heart. The angry young man who had questioned God and allowed bitterness to consume him was gone. In his place stood someone humbled by suffering and transformed by mercy. Asher began sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. He spoke about repentance, faith, and the God who had met him in the darkness. His words carried a sincerity that touched many hearts. As the plague continued to cast its shadow over Shalem, more people began turning back to God. Families gathered to pray together. Neighbors who had been divided by years of conflict sought forgiveness and reconciliation. For the first time in months, hope began to return. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. Several village leaders remained stubborn and proud. They refused to acknowledge their need for God and mocked those who did. The village now stood at a crossroads between pride and repentance, and unknown to them all, a greater test was fast approaching. The night of the storm. Just when the people of Shalem thought the worst was over, a new disaster appeared on the horizon. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered across the sky, covering the village in an unsettling darkness. The air grew heavy, and a strong wind began to howl through the streets. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full force. Thunder shook the ground, lightning split the sky, and rain poured down without mercy. Water rushed from the surrounding hills, turning roads into rivers and fields into lakes. Families fled their homes as floodwaters surged through the village. Amid the chaos, Asher refused to run from danger. Remembering the mercy God had shown him, he spent the night helping others. He carried frightened children to safety, guided elderly villagers through the floodwaters, and rescued families trapped inside collapsing homes. The storm raged for hours. Many feared Shalem would not survive the night. But when dawn finally broke, the rain stopped, and the winds grew silent. The village had suffered great loss. Crops were destroyed, homes were damaged, and many possessions were swept away. Yet as the people gathered together, they realized something remarkable. Despite the destruction, far more lives had been spared than anyone expected. The disaster shook the hearts of the villagers. Pride faded, and humility took its place. For the first time in years, the entire village came together to seek God, realizing that their greatest hope was not in themselves but in Him. Mercy after judgment. In the weeks following the storm, something remarkable began to happen in Shalem. The plague that had once spread fear through every household started to lose its grip on the village. Day by day, fewer people fell sick. Those who had been close to death slowly regained their strength, and for the first time in many months, no new graves were dug. Hope, which had seemed lost forever, began to return. The sounds of mourning were gradually replaced by laughter, prayer, and thanksgiving. People who had once ignored God now gathered openly to seek Him. Neighbors who had been divided by bitterness forgave one another. Broken families found healing, and old wounds began to mend. Asher rejoiced at the change he saw around him, but there was still one question that lingered in his heart. Almost every evening he walked to the burial ground where Miriam rested. Though time had eased his pain, he still wondered why God had allowed his sister to die. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Asher stood quietly beside her grave. The questions remained, but the anger was gone. In its place was a deep and unexpected peace. For the first time, he understood that faith does not require having every answer. Sometimes, trusting God means believing His wisdom is greater than our understanding. And as Asher looked toward the fading light, he knew he could trust the one who sees what we cannot. The meaning of the prophecy. Years passed before Asher finally understood the true meaning of the traveler's mysterious prophecy. Time had brought healing to Shalem, and the young man who once struggled with grief and anger had grown into a respected leader within the community. Yet the words never left his mind. One among you will die and live again. For many years, Asher believed the prophecy referred to someone being raised physically from the dead. He often wondered if he had missed its fulfillment. But one quiet evening, while reflecting on everything that had happened since the plague, the truth suddenly became clear. The prophecy had never been about physical resurrection. It had been about him. The angry, broken young man who had stood beside Miriam's grave blaming God for his pain had died in that dark cave. The bitterness, pride, and despair that once controlled his heart had been buried there. The man who emerged from the cave was not the same person who entered it. Though his body had survived, something even greater had happened. God had transformed his heart. The God who kills and makes alive had put Asher's old self to death and raised within him a new spirit filled with faith, humility, and hope. Only now did he fully understand that the greatest miracle of all had not been escaping death. It had been experiencing a new life in God. The God who makes alive. Asher eventually became one of Shalem's most respected elders. Though many years had passed, he never forgot the plague, the loss of Miriam, or the dark cave where his life changed forever. Whenever young people gathered around him, he shared his story. He told them how grief had filled his heart with anger and doubt, and how God's mercy met him in his darkest moment. Through every trial, he discovered that God was still faithful. Asher explained that God's power over life and death goes beyond the body. He can heal broken hearts, restore lost hope, revive weak faith, and bring light into the deepest darkness. Standing before a new generation, he often repeated the words that once frightened him. The God of Israel is the one who kills and makes alive. Now he spoke them with confidence. He had learned that even in suffering, God's purpose is redemption. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not escaping death, but being transformed by God's grace. Asher's life became a testimony that God can bring new life from the darkest seasons. If you were Asher, would your faith have survived the loss of Miriam? Share your answer below, and follow for more powerful Bible-inspired stories filled with faith, hope, and life-changing lessons.